Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we finally got another unscripted movie review, this time of the newest film in the Rocky franchise, Creed 2. And you know, the funny thing is that I wouldn't otherwise categorize Creed 1 as just another entry in the franchise. And that's kind of a distinct thing to call out because I remember sitting down to see Creed 1 and seeing how great of a movie it really was, and then stepping back and realizing what was the alchemy that made it work. Of course, a huge part of this was Michael B. Jordan stepping up as the son of Apollo Creed, Adonis Creed, and really bringing a level of magnetism and charisma to the performance that you wouldn't otherwise expect, especially given some of the character arc twists that happened in that movie. And then you had Ryan Coogler stepping up as director, really putting forward a tour de force performance and being able to revitalize the series before he would go on and work on Black Panther, and saw how that turned out. But here's the thing that I think needs to be called out as most importantly, and I think Ryan Coogler nailed this, being able to step into the Rocky franchise as in incorporate elements of the mythology, being able to step in but take a relatively fresh take. It wasn't just marinating in the previous 6 Rocky movies that had come before. And I'll be honest, not all those Rocky movies are good, but I still like the franchise, but it's being able to differentiate itself enough while still live in that world, and that gave it a lot of power. And now we got Creed 2. Another movie in a Rocky franchise. Yeah, this is what kind of annoyed the living piss out of me with this movie, because I was sitting down really trying to like it, but the immediate comparisons that came up for me were Rocky 2 and Rocky 4. If you haven't gone back to watch Rocky 4, it's one of those movies that hits the so bad it's good limit, because it's very clear that everybody on set was doing ridiculous amounts of cocaine and basically shoving in anything that was very 80s of the time, including a level of Cold War paranoia that honestly kind of threw me off guard the last time I watched it. And you know what? It's not terrible if you're going just there for the fight and some of the beefcake laugh out loud silliness of it all. It can be a fun watch, but it hasn't aged well. It's really kind of bad at points. So reintegrating all that level of continuity back into the franchise by bringing in Ivan Drago and his son Victor Drago to resurrect the fight that originally happened between Apollo Creed and now Adonis Creed stepping into his father's mantle. Yeah, I can understand the temptation that would inevitably come with all that iconography smashing together. And if you're invested in the Rocky iconography, I can see you getting the contact high off of it. The problem is, when you get past the contact high, and admittedly it's a good one, because if you're just here for the fights and the training montages and some of the music things, you're gonna get that, especially when you start getting the more extended continuity references that basically make up the final third of the movie. But if you're into that, you'll have a blast with it. You'll really be able to get that high. The problem is actually digging past that. Once you dig a little bit further beneath that, there's really not a lot to this movie, and that's what kind of frustrated me the most. Basically what happened is that you're dealing with a much weaker screenplay and honestly directorial staging at some level. A lot of the scenes are not shot with nearly as intense amount of visual language and film language in the same way, and it honestly makes several scenes come across as oddly cheap looking when they're not taking part of the extended training montage. And okay, I get those scenes are really just to string things together, but what Ryan Coogler understood is that the reason why we cared about Adonis Creed and his relationship with Rocky was the character development, the time that it was spent away from the boxing ring. Sure, you had to nail the boxing ring portions in order to get people in the seats, but there was more of a story going on. Whereas with this, again, it's a lot of callbacks to Rocky franchise movies, and there's not a lot really going on underneath. Like, go into Rocky's primary story arc in this film. I get that there's a level of history that has to come, given his involvement in Rocky 4 and his relationship with the Drago family, and honestly, there was some real tension when he and Ivan Drago confront each other for the first time. I thought it really came together well. And now come back to the one thing in this movie that I think worked incredibly well, and we will get to it. But at the same time, a lot of his arc just circles back to the family connection. A lot of the family connection that was last explored, if I remember correctly, in Rocky V. Nobody wants to be reminded of Rocky V, even if you're trying to draw a parallel thematic arc that barely connects. And what's worse is that if we're going into the whole family arc of the story, it means we gotta talk about Tessa Thompson's character, who really isn't given much to do except pump out a baby. And yeah, I guess that's appropriate, but she had an internal life to her character coming out of Creed that just feels her shoved aside just like another Rocky love interest that happened in that franchise. And I didn't want to see an actress as good as her put in that lane, even if there are some added implications that are coming out of Creed 1 that does feed into this. I think part of the problem is that Michael B. Jordan isn't just given the same amount of opportunities to express real charisma, at least in some of his chemistry it seems with Tessa Thompson. I mean, they've got moments where they can actually connect and slow things down, but honestly, after the first big fight of the film, you kind of lose a lot of that chemistry, and it just does not connect nearly as well as he gets entirely into his own head. And training montage time, I mean, we've seen this before. It becomes another Rocky movie, and it becomes thinner than ever, and I think it's all the more disappointing because it was coming off of a film that had so much distinctive internal life. Now, the one thing I will say for this film is that in trying to humanize the Drago family, they actually tapped into some interesting elements here. The funny thing is that they've probably become one of the most sympathetic elements in the entire film, as they were a family after losing the big fight in Rocky IV. They lost everything. They became nothing, and then the Soviet Union collapsed. So there's elements and questions of what happens when you are a cultural symbol who is discarded in that lane in comparison with what Rocky did. And there is elements of iconography that I honestly wish the film had dug a little bit more into. And then there's parts where they're trying to give that whole plot line, that family, a little bit more life in terms of them being re-embraced by the Russian community when Ivan and Victor Drago start winning again. And I think there was some internal life that could have been perpetuated there. But again, it feels like the screenplay was really chopped down, just didn't know where to take these characters, or didn't want to make them too sympathetic, especially when he's the upscrabble underdog who's working on a construction site, and Creed isn't, as he's now the world champion defending his title. And it's a weird power dynamic. It always feels a little bit weird when the protagonist in a boxing movie is not the underdog, and that's honestly would have been a problem with some of the Rocky movies too, and this is as much of a case here. I honestly think they should have doubled down on the humanization that came with the Drago characters, and maybe actually played into a lot more of the parallels that ran between them. I mean, they play up some of it, but the screenplay's a little bit too sloppy to really drill into all of them. Now, that being said, if you're there for the fights and the montages, they're bloody, they're explicit, they get what they need to do right, and they will inevitably satisfy anybody who's just looking down to sit down for another Rocky movie. But if you're coming off of Creed, nah, I'm sorry, it should be better than this, and I do think that losing Ryan Coogler probably really hurt this film. I mean, it's fine. It's a lark. It's a good sit. I can sit back and watch this like I can watch any other mid-tier Rocky sequel like Rocky 3. But honestly, for me, it's a 6 out of 10. I'm gonna forget I saw most of this movie outside of some certain montage moments, because really the stylism that came with those moments saves the film. But beyond that, this is thin and arguably pretty forgettable. If you haven't seen it, give it a watch if you're curious, but most of the time I'd skip it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, sorry I didn't have more to say about this one, but it feels like just another Rocky movie, and honestly, I've seen Rocky movies that are better in this lane. But if you want to actually, I guess you can't really buy or stream the movie, it's not out there yet. But hey, if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, the link to my Patreon is right over there. So 3 times a week, you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, guys get to add albums, movies, or even the top 10 list to that schedule. You don't want to see what's on my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. And for your guys' opinion on the movie, got the poll up there. Have fun, tell me how wrong I am. Although the critics have been kind of mixed in this movie as a whole, some of the audiences have been too. You never know what happens. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.